Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. We're looking forward to continuing our workshop series on advancing digital agriculture and conservation. My name is Sherry Rogie-Fiddler, and I'm President and CEO of Farm Foundation. As I mentioned in our first session, this workshop series comes at an important time when we are experiencing a mixture of gains and losses in conservation progress paired with increasing but uneven adoption of digital ag. We're pleased so many of you could join us today for our ongoing discussion, and we hope that we'll be able to find some ways to collaborate as a result of this series to help advance digital ag and conservation. So for those of you who may not know Farm Foundation, we invite you to follow us on social media as noted here. And just as a quick recap, Farm Foundation is an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture. And one way we do this is through collaborations such as today's workshop series. And our hope, as I mentioned, is that it will catalyze further partnerships to advance digital ag and conservation. And just to note that if you do want to post on social media today, please use #DigitalAgWorkshop. Next slide, please. So Farm Foundation has had the wonderful opportunity to collaborate with Stephen Wolf at Cornell and Jonathan Koppas and Kathy Bayless from University of Illinois to bring this series to you. And we want to thank them for their collaboration and also recognize and thank our corporate sponsors, Corteva AgriScience and Microsoft, for their generous support of this workshop series. We're excited to kick off this session, but first just want to go over a few housekeeping notes here. For those of you that were with us last time, this will be familiar, but just to highlight a few things for Q&A, make sure you see the Q&A button and post your questions there, not the chat button, but the Q&A button. And as you submit your questions, make sure you post your name and company or organization you're with. Just to highlight a new feature this time, last time we had an interest in having people linger a bit longer after the workshop series is done. So we'll remind you about this at the end of the session too, but this time we've offered a 30-minute virtual coffee break to interact a little bit further after the series. To join that, you will have to copy and paste the coffee break link that we'll share at the end of the session in order to join that. It'll be a separate link. So just to do a quick recap of our workshop objectives, the objectives really are to advance policy dialogue to realize the potential of applying applying digital ag to conservation and strengthening the science policy interface. As I mentioned for Farm Foundation, one of our objectives is also to accelerate digital ag and conservation. And we got a lot of your feedback last time and really hope that this will be an interactive session. We'll be integrating some polling, as you mentioned. And please do remember that you can post your questions throughout the entire workshop. Next slide, please. So for this morning's workshop, we will hear a few brief remarks from Stephen Wolf from Cornell, followed by our moderator, Jonathan Koppas, and our three speakers. And I'd like to extend just a personal warm welcome to our three speakers today, and Jonathan will introduce them soon. But our three speakers today are Stephen Hagan, Sarah Bebout, and Alyssa Charney. We're really pleased that they could join us today to share their insights with us. So just again, a quick reminder, you can submit your questions throughout today's session. You don't have to wait for the Q&A time. One other note is that there is a collaboration space on the website, so we encourage you to follow up there. As we said, one of the goals is to catalyze collaboration, so I invite you to do that as well. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Stephen Wolf for a brief introduction of Cornell and to kick off our session. Stephen.
Thanks, Sherry. I appreciate it. And again, just to thank our speakers, our sponsors, and the collaborators who've made this event possible, and Jonathan and Kathy and Farm Foundation particularly. And just to amplify Sherry's remarks, that we really hope that this dialogue continues and extends beyond the 90 minutes. And I encourage you to use the forum page and to reach out to us to share ideas. That our webinar has attracted tremendous interest in a broad cross-section of people with a range of experience and expertise. And tapping into that is really one of our goals. And our idea is that the emergence of new digital capabilities creates opportunities for changes in farm management that can advance conservation At the same time, some of the changes in land use could pose risks for conservation. Additionally, these new digital capabilities could create opportunities for new modes of policy, for example, targeting incentive payments in more precise manner, as an example of what could emerge from the intersection of environmental conservation interest and digital agriculture. At Cornell, we're engaged in a long-term, broad collaborative effort across 5 colleges, over 100 faculty, involving students and external partners. And this webinar is an example of the kind of exciting programming we're launching, and we encourage you to check out our webpage and contact us to share your interests and experience. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Koppas from the University of Illinois.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks, Sherry, and to the Farm Foundation team. This has been a great effort, and so I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to our discussions today. So I want to just take a moment to talk a little bit about some of the work that's going on at the University of Illinois. But as we do that, or as I go over that, you should see a poll that will show up. There it is on the screen. And this just to get a sense of, we wanted to see maybe who all was on and get a sense of who's participating in this. So if you take a moment to fill out that poll, we'll put the results up here in a minute. And a couple quick notes on what's going on at the University of Illinois. A couple different programs, one of which we started up recently, the Center for Digital Agriculture, which is basically a partnership, a multidisciplinary effort for research, education, and outreach that involves the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, the Institute for Genomic Biology, and the College of Agriculture, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences, as well as the Granger College of Engineering. So working together to try to find research solutions around digital agriculture. We've also just begun standing up the Center for Economics of Sustainability, cutting edge research and engagement regarding sustainable food and energy production using economics and policy design to promote economic health and human well-being, partnering with stakeholders and researchers. And finally, we also have continued to operate the Gardner Program for Agricultural Policy, built out of an endowment by Lynn and Lila Gardner and the Illinois Farm Bureau family of businesses, in an effort to really provide a leading voice on agricultural policy. And some recent examples that people may be familiar with includes web-based tools such as the Farm Program Payment Calculator for the 2018 Farm Bill programs, crop insurance and valuation tools. And coming soon, we are hoping to release soon a web-based decision support tool for cover crop practices. And so just again, kind of a quick summary of some examples of what we're doing here at the University of Illinois. And Morgan, if we've gotten enough responses on the poll, you want to go ahead and show? All right, so an overwhelming presence from the government or university sector in today's discussion. That's great. We appreciate everybody who is in attendance, and thank you for taking began week. So the co-founder, chief operating officer, and senior scientist at Dagan Incorporated. Also with us today is Sarah Bebout, the national program leader for sustainable intensification at the United States Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Research Service, Office of National Programs. And our third panelist today is Alyssa Charney, who is a legislative assistant for Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania and was previously with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And she's going to talk about policy as well. So let's get started. Steve Hagan, we're going to open, there's your bio page. And Steve, the floor is yours. Thank you for participating in this discussion.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thanks, Stephen and Sherry, for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here and participating in this workshop. So I am a senior remote sensing scientist and the head of operations at Dagan Inc. And in my time today, I want to try to communicate 3 things with you. I want to let you know a little bit about who we are as a company at Dagan. I want to tell you about the technology that we and other organizations are putting to use in the digital ag and conservation space. And I want to outline some important links between this type of technology and public policy. So Dagan was founded in 2018 as a spinoff from Applied Geosolutions, a research company with about 20 years of history in making environmental tech applications. About a year ago, we received a seed investment from Neglected Climate Opportunities, and we're located about 1 hour north of Boston, up in Durham, New Hampshire, near the University of New Hampshire. And with that spinoff that happened about a year and a half ago, we brought two technologies with us from Applied Geosolutions over to Dagan, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But we and other organizations, including government research organizations like the team at ARS in Beltsville, university researchers like folks we have here, folks at Cornell and the University of Illinois and North Carolina State, just to name a few, and as well as like private companies, General Mills, Indigo Ag, Land O'Lakes, many others. You know, there's a lot of great, exciting research and development going on in ag tech and conservation. And what I'll talk with you about is just a little bit from our perspective and the tools that we're working with and developing and applying, and give you hopefully a broader sense of what's going on in this space. And just to say that we as a company, we're working to be some of the leaders in the adoption of regenerative ag, and we think we can help support that with some of our technologies. So with that said, we're working to track conservation ag, soil health practices, as well as the outcomes associated with those practices at broad scales, but also with a new level of detail. And I'll take you for a brief walk through what one set of those technologies looks like. So here we're integrating two foundational pieces of technology at Dagan. One we call Optis, the Operational Tillage Information System on the left side there. And the other is a biogeochemical model called DNDC. Optis stands for the Operational Tillage Information System, but it's more than that at this point. It's a remote sensing based system to track conservation practices, including tillage practices, but also including cover cropping, crop rotations. And what we do, we rely on primarily publicly available Earth observing satellite data to map and monitor the adoption of tillage practices, cover crops, crop rotations across wide areas. The raw residue cover information, crop type information, cover crop information from Optis comes through the system at the subfield scale, at the 30-meter resolution. And we've applied that across the Corn Belt, out into the wheat belt, and we're extending out across the contiguous US. And it's important to note that these data go back through time as well. We have the ability to go back to the early 2000s with the satellite sensors that we integrate here. And then, so on the right side, we've got DNDC. And DNDC is a soil biogeochemical model. It's a process-based model that takes information on ag management and integrates that with information about weather and about soil properties, and integrates those things together. And then through the process of modeling soil microbial processes, modeling crop growth, vegetation growth, tracking carbon and nitrogen cycles, it produces estimates about outcomes like soil organic carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, N2O, as well as crop productivity and other attributes. And I'll just say, we as a company, we're extremely lucky. We've had amazing partners through our the short history of our company, but going back to Applied Geosolutions as well. Amazing partners that have really been critical to our development as a company and the development of these tools. And so these tools were applied across the Corn Belt in a public-private partnership between Dagan, the Nature Conservancy, the Conservation Technology Information Center, the USDA's Office of Energy and Environmental Policy, and a few other critical supporters. And the results of that are available online at ctic.org/Optus at the bottom of the screen there. If you go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about that effort. We looked at from 2005 through 2018. Again, at the farm field scale is where this processing is going on. So the data are longitudinal. We can track them through time. So we track and model each of the approximately 1.7 million farm fields through time, looking at changes in management practices, crop rotations, tillage intensity, cover cropping, and we model the associated outcomes on SOC, N2O, reactive nitrogen. And we do that again at the farm field scale. More than that, we run a set of counterfactual scenarios. For example, the use of no conservation practices on a particular farm field. And we hold that against what we observed with Optus's input to the model to compare the outcomes of what we observed and the counterfactual to gain a better understanding of soil health benefits of practices. And it's important to note, again, that the data are processed at the field scale, the subfield scale, but then they're summarized and distributed through CTIC's webpage at aggregated scales, watershed scales, and crop reporting district scales for public insights. And you can, I hope with this sort of description, you can start to see the power of these sorts of tools. You know, we can look at which areas use conservation management, what regions were sort of early adopters, how has the use of these practices changed over time, and what are the soil health outcomes, the benefits and challenges associated with these changes in these patterns. I'm not going to go into detailed results here, but what we saw in this application across the Corn Belt from 2005 to 2018 was expected. Conservation tillage adoption rates were high across that time period, and 50% plus, but they don't increase between 2005 and 2018. And I think that reflects what a lot of us understand about the earlier sort of push and adoption of conservation tillage practices. Cover crops, on the other hand, had lower rates of adoption, 2%, 3%, but they really started to tick up in 2014, 2015 through the end of the study period. And it's interesting to dig into spatial patterns of change as well. And yeah, if you go to the next slide, I encourage you all to do that. CTIC, TNC, and actually the Walton Family Foundation have supported the development of what you see here, visualization tools that allow, anybody who's interested can explore these data spatially and sort of temporally through the tools available there. So we're not the only ones doing this sort of thing. I mean, I think this is the first sort of broad application made publicly available, but these tools are maturing rapidly. Lots of folks across the spectrum are working on these tools, and I hope you can see the sort of power that that these tools can add detailed information, again, across wide areas and through time in a way that really can only be done with remote sensing and modeling. And if you go to the next slide, it's exciting from my perspective, and I think we're starting to gain insights that are promising, and I want to walk you through one sort of side path on some of the insights. We did an initial analysis on Prevent Plant in 2019, and so we used our remote sensing tools and this existing database of historical practices on the field scale to examine the link between conservation practice adoption and resilience, specifically in this case, the ability to plant in wet conditions. And so we've only applied this at the county scale in 3 counties that were particularly had high rates of Prevent Plant in 2019. But what we saw was interesting. I'll just describe the process. We used the satellite data to identify and separate out two populations of fields, those that were prevented from planting in 2019 and those that were able to successfully plant in 2019 in those counties. And then we looked at the historical use of conservation practices in those two populations. And in all three of the counties we looked at, the use of conservation tillage and cover cropping was higher in the fields that were able to successfully plant in 2019 and lower in the fields that were prevented from planting. I don't want to hesitate to note that this is a small study and is really more anecdotal at this point than anything, but we're working to expand the analysis. And I think it does highlight the type of insights and relationships that this type of technology can provide. And so if we go to the next slide, the sort of technology and data that come from the technology are, I hope I've shown, are useful for research and in building our understanding of relationships between conservation and outcomes, resilience. But they hold other promises too. The ecosystem service markets are on the ascent right now, ESMC, NORI, Indigo Ag's Terraton effort, and others. It's an exciting time for these markets. And in the past, I think these markets have struggled in part due to high transaction costs, the costs associated with verifying practices and outcomes. But I think tools like Optis and DNDC and other remote sensing and modeling tools out there, they hold, I think, real promise of lowering those transaction costs and, help us replace at least some of the in-person visits and measurements with reliable estimates from remote sensing and modeling. And then with lower transaction costs, I think we have the opportunity to provide higher payments to growers, which has to be at the center of a successful marketplace. And I think these tools can also support ag finance, land valuation, crop insurance, and help support innovative new products in crop insurance and innovative new incentive programs. They provide insight into risk and resilience at the farm field level. And looking with some of the few folks that we know in ag finance and in crop insurance, they're looking to absorb this sort of information to make better products and decisions. And I guess as I wrap up my part of the presentation here, I want to recenter a little bit and say that I've spent time making the case about the power of remote sensing and modeling tools, but it's critical not to overlook at what's at the core of this, and that's on-field observations and the role that they play. They're the foundation of these new technologies and insights. The models that underlie these new technologies, they have to be trained and tested on field observations collected across the spectrum of cropping systems, soil types, weather management practices. And so there's a beneficial relationship here. I think that growers control their information and should benefit from sharing of the information. That in turn provides improvements to methods and models, and that in turn, makes potentially more opportunities for growers to earn benefits from ecosystem service markets, improve crop insurance and lending opportunities as well. And I think my last nod would be that I think the government has a role to play here too, that, we can speed the research and development of digital ag tools by the creation of something like a data warehouse that I know exists in the FIA on the forest side, but that makes detailed USDA databases available for the research and development of tools and for the analysis of conservation practices and the effects on risk. Also being clear though that the databases are designed to protect the confidential field and farm level data collected by the USDA. And so from my experience in this space, coordinated partnerships between government, industry, NGOs, researchers are really important, and I guess it's why I was thrilled to be invited here to this workshop and be part of the follow-up conversations that come from it. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Steve. That was a great presentation. A lot to think through there. So we're going to switch now to or hand off the mic here to Sarah Bebout with the Agricultural Research Service at USDA. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation. Take it away.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm Sarah Bebout from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Research Service. And my role in this seminar series is to provide a public sector perspective on how big data advances the cause of sustainable agriculture or conservation practices. I use the term big data several times throughout the presentation, and I'm using it in a fairly simple sense of using very large data sets, and they're usually very large because they've been collected across space and time, combined with each other to support digital agriculture. So this photo, these two photos, are a reminder that productivity and sustainability are not opposites. So these photos show a dairy farm in Washington State that has been participating in a NRCS water quality conservation project. They're managing both the manure and the stream banks to prevent excess nutrients from polluting the water, thereby improving the stream habitat for salmon. Next slide, please. My first main point is that the time is really ripe for using big data to advance sustainable agriculture, with major initiatives in both the public and private sectors. On the left, we have a public sector initiative, and on the right, a list of examples of private sector initiatives. In February of this year, the US Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, announced the USDA Agriculture Innovation Agenda, which guides the many USDA agencies to work towards common goals for the ag sector. The goals he announced include increasing ag productivity by 40% while decreasing the environmental footprint of agriculture by 50%. Some of the specific ways that the agenda sets out to decrease the environmental footprint include decreasing food loss and waste, increasing carbon sequestration and decreasing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, improving water quality and quantity, and increasing the use of renewable energy. On the right, I have listed 3 examples of private sector initiatives for promoting sustainable practices. USDA does not endorse any particular private sector initiative, but rather provides data in support of all who want to use it. Last week's presenters, Jason Weller and Charles Barron, as well as Steve Hagan just now, mentioned the importance of public sector data and research in the development of their private sector initiatives. All of these initiatives, both public and private, require that we collect and use data in new ways. Morgan, please put up the first polling question. Let's see, I don't see it up yet. Is it coming? Maybe I just can't see it from my view.
Yes, the poll is up. And actually, while it's up, I'm just going to jump in with a housekeeping matter. We've had a few comments saying that the photos of the speakers are blocking the slides. And just as we're all getting used to Zoom, just a reminder that you can actually choose in the upper right-hand corner if you want none of the speaker pics to block the slides. You can choose that, or you can have them be in a line or in a cluster. So that's an option that you can choose as a viewer. And hopefully, probably by now, people have been able to complete the poll, which we are able to see, Sarah. Morgan, do we have sufficient responses? Great, thank you.
Can I see the responses? Or are they being shown? Oh, there we are. Good. So I see that many people got the correct answer, which is D. The Ag Innovation Agenda does not include anything about environmental regulation. Secretary Perdue's desire is for America's farmers and ranchers to provide leadership through voluntary environmental stewardship. He does not want more regulation. Next slide, please. For the next few slides, I will be providing examples of 3 major ways that big data advances sustainable agriculture. First, big data enables us to do better planning than ever before in terms of deciding where to put conservation practices to have the most benefit for the environment. Second, big data enables producers to more effectively implement conservation practices. And third, big data enables producers to get more profit from using conservation practices. For each example, I'll provide a status statement to let you know whether the example is current or futuristic. I'll use the term, if I say that the status is in use, it means that the example is already used by multiple stakeholders. If I say it's in development, it means that some parts are economically feasible and already in use, while other parts are still experimental. And futuristic means that the idea is still in the proof of concept stage, not yet very close to being economically feasible for producers. Next slide, please. So first, an example of how big data advances the planning of conservation practices. This is an example from water quality, and there are similar examples for erosion and soil carbon sequestration. So this tool is called the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework. It is available, it's an ArcGIS toolbox that combines multiple types of data sets, which I've listed there, and you can see some of them across the bottom of the screen. It's designed to answer the questions on a watershed basis about which fields are most prone to contributing runoff to streams, where could field scale and edge of field conservation practices be effective, and what are the opportunities for managing riparian areas, including it provides a way to calculate a recommended width of riparian buffer strips for a particular landscape. So the status of this one is that it's in use. It is in use by experts. You have to have GIS experience and some modeling experience to use it. So it's not really available for the general public, although it is available for anyone who wants to use it. There's no cost associated with it. Next slide, please. So now for an example of how big data advances the implementation of sustainable ag practices in cropping systems. And this project that I'm showing here is called Precision Sustainable Agriculture, with a link there provided. How it works is that there's a combination of sensors and drone imagery, and the drones can be both aerial drones, as shown in the picture, and terrestrial drones. They look like little robots that drive between the rows of crops. These sensors provide information about soil moisture, pest pressure, such as weeds or insects, and leaf color, and they enable the producer to use real-time precision management of fertilizers and irrigation and pest management. The status of this is in development. Some of these things are available and becoming economically feasible for farmers, and others not really economically feasible yet. Next slide, please. Now for an example that's a little bit more futuristic. It's an example of how big data advances the implementation of sustainable livestock production practices. So virtual fencing is a futuristic concept. We're still in the very early days of research to test the proof of concept. How it works is that livestock wear GPS-guided collars and receive a mildly electric shock if they stray across a virtual fence line, which can be programmed by the farmer. So if we can get this to work, it has the potential to enable a variety of improved livestock management practices, precision livestock management, if you will, including exclusion from riparian areas, exclusion from rangeland areas with toxic plants, and rotational grazing. The main limitation on using rotational grazing as a conservation practice is that there's a tremendous amount of labor required to move the animals regularly from one part of the pasture to another. So if virtual fencing can work, you could imagine just moving the animals by changing your virtual fence on your computer. So this technology is somewhat further developed in Australia than in the US. Right now in the US, the research, which is mostly being done in partnership with Australian companies, is testing animal behavior in cattle with these collars to verify that the cattle do indeed stay away from the areas that they're virtually fenced out of. Next slide, please. Now for an example of how big data advances opportunities for value addition for sustainable practices. Steve mentioned this a bit a moment ago as well. Well, we hope that producers will find sustainable practices to be more profitable eventually. We also know that there are often significant costs associated with implementing things like cover crops or riparian buffers, and that some of these costs continue in perpetuity, such as the opportunity cost for taking land out of catch crop production. For several decades, we have been preparing for ecosystem services markets, where farmers will be paid additional money for implementing sustainable practices. There may be some consumers who are willing to pay more for sustainably produced food, but when we talk of payments for ecosystem services, we mean buyers who pay directly for the service being provided, carbon sequestration, water quality, or biodiversity, for example, rather than people who are paying for the food or fiber being produced. So buyers may include industries who want to improve their environmental footprint. One of the limitations to this concept, as Steve also mentioned, has been the lack of availability of data that provides buyers with the confidence that they are getting what they're paying for. So big data and digital agriculture can help this, one, by providing baselines, basically analyzing historical data sets that can be used to set a baseline value. For example, the amount of soil carbon in a particular field on a specified year. They can also provide information about when and where conservation practices have been implemented, and Steve gave excellent examples of this. This photo is from the spring 2020 planting gallery on USDA's Flickr website, and it shows what a field looks like that has been planted without tillage. So this can be detected with remote imagery, as Steve described. Big data analysis also improves models that enable the amount of soil carbon sequestered to be estimated quantitatively based on the implementation of conservation practices. Next slide, please. So here is a review of the examples I've discussed about how big data enables sustainable agriculture. Morgan, please put up the second polling question. So which big data application are you most interested in or excited about? Let's give people an opportunity to respond for a minute. Big data enables us to do conservation better than ever before by improving planning, implementation, and value addition of sustainable practices. Do we have enough responses to look at the data yet, Morgan, or are we still waiting for a few more to come in?
At about 70%, so we can go ahead and show that.
Okay. That's interesting to see. And I've put some resources in the collaboration forum section of the website for the seminar series that will provide you more information about each of these areas, including I posted something from the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium's website about what types of buyers might be interested in paying for ecosystem services. Next slide, please. Since I am from a research agency, I would be remiss if I didn't mention how research uses big data. So the research has to be done before the other examples that I've shared are possible. Partnerships for Data Innovation is an agricultural research service-led public-private initiative to improve the way we analyze and learn from the vast amounts of research data that are being produced. All federally funded research data is supposed to be open to the public. I say supposed to be because achieving open data is easier said than done, and we're still working on improving data availability. This partnership and the initiative does provide some of what Steve was talking about in his last slide about how he hopes that the public sector can, in a way, get its act together and make it easier for everyone to find the data that is needed for digital agriculture. One example of a project under this initiative is the Fertilizer Recommendation Support Tool. I chose this example because Charles mentioned it last week, and he said that one barrier he has to deal with is the lack of standardization of soil tests. Historically, every state has done its own calibration between soil test results and fertilizer recommendations for different crops and different soil types. This project brings together scientists from the Agricultural Research Service and many state university faculty and extension partners to develop a tool to resolve this challenge and make the tool available to two types of users, what they have referred to here in their objective statements as general users and research users. So this project is still relatively young and there is not yet a website to refer you to, but I wanted you to know that the challenge Charles mentioned is in the process of being resolved. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. Since I'm representing USDA in this seminar series, I wanted to provide you with some information about how various USDA agencies contribute resources related to big data for sustainable ag. There are many more agencies within USDA than are listed here, but these are the ones most relevant to this topic. So some of the agencies provide data that can be used by the public and some provide funding. On the collaboration page for session 2, I have posted a list of links to the relevant resources for each of these agencies. And I want to talk through them a little bit here so that you're aware of what's available. The first two agencies on the list, ARS and ERS, are in-house research agencies that collect different types of data. I'm from ARS, and we do a wide variety of research related to sustainable agriculture: production, conservation, modeling, agricultural systems optimization, remote sensing, a lot of different research. ERS does all kinds of economic analyses. The most relevant survey they do for this audience is called the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, and they do it on a scheduled basis once every 5 years or something. And you will find a link to it in my post on the forum, collaboration forum. NASS is unique in its mandate in that its mandate is to collect data on the entire American agriculture sector and make it available for use by the public. I should clarify here that farm level data is considered private and therefore not made available for use by the public, but aggregated data is made available. NASS has two main types of survey: the agricultural census, which is done once every 5 years, and smaller, more focused surveys on specific topics that are done in between the census years. So they also use satellite imagery to monitor the amount of each crop that is planted each season, the area that is planted to each crop. They make this data available on their cropland data layer, and there's a link to that in the post. NIFA is USDA's main funding agency. They manage competitive grant programs on a wide variety of topics, and sustainable agriculture is always one of their topics. NRCS's role is to promote conservation practices, and they maintain key databases such as the soil survey. They also provide cost sharing for producers who implement conservation practices, and they provide research funding for sustainable ag. Morgan, please put up the third polling question now. This is to see if you're still awake, because I basically just gave you the answer, but I also wanted you to remember which agencies provide funding and which do not. We do also work together reasonably well within USDA. We're supposed to be working as one USDA, and so we collaborate a lot and we share data with each other, and sometimes ARS applies for funding from NIFA or NRCS, usually in collaboration with university partners. So NIFA's main goal is to set up funding for universities, land-grant universities, and extension systems. And I see that many people have answered correctly. The answer is the last one, both NIFA and NRCS. Although NIFA is the main funding agency, NRCS does provide some research funds in their Conservation Innovation Grant Program. Just to clarify, you won't get very far if you ask ARS, ERS, or NASS for funds, because that is not how Congress has mandated that they spend their funds. They're supposed to be doing other things. So with that, I'm finished with my part of the presentation and will be happy to answer questions during the Q&A time.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a great presentation. A lot of really good information. And I want to make two quick plugs, and then we'll move on to Alyssa, our third speaker, our third panelist here. One is let's get questions if you have them, type them in and submit them. I also wanted to note or reiterate what Sarah said. She posted quite a few links and a lot of really great information on the collaboration page of the website for this workshop. So if you're looking to find different sources, that's a great place to find it. And she provided a lot of really good information there. So check that out. Not right now, but later after we've completed this session. And with that, I want to welcome Alyssa Charney, who's a legislative assistant for Senator Bob Casey, and she is going to present on conservation policy and talk us through that part of it, and then we'll go to the question and answer. So Alyssa, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Jonathan, and thank you to the Farm Foundation and Cornell and University of Illinois for putting together this workshop. I'm really excited to be here to get to have this conversation with you all. As was mentioned, my name is Alyssa Charney. I handle agriculture for Senator Bob Casey, including his work on the Senate Agriculture Committee. I am based in the Senator's DC office, though of course currently working from my home office. And yeah, this is a topic that I'm excited about and excited to kind of shift our conversation to think about why this information and data and conversation is so important for the policy work that is going on in DC as well. So next slide, please. So just want to take a step back and kind of orient ourselves in terms of why Congress and policymakers care about data and outcomes and all of the great work that Steve and Sarah and many others are doing. I think, you know, it's pretty straightforward as to why scientists and researchers and academics care about this, but I think also want to think about why does, or at least should, Congress and the folks who are doing the policy making, why should we care about this information? So a couple of things. First, this data, these resources are really important for us to be able to do our job, and part of that job is authorizing legislation that spends money on conservation investments. As you may have noticed, at times it is very challenging for Congress to make those investments. At times we shut down the government because we cannot figure out how to spend those dollars. So any type of investment in conservation spending or anything, it makes it easier for us to do that job if we can explain these are the benefits that are going to result from the investments that we are making. That means, you know, we need the data to understand the on-the-ground impacts of conservation investments from federal spending. Next, this data is also really important for us to be able to effectively target conservation dollars. As you know, there are limited federal dollars available. The more data and information on outcomes and conservation benefits we have, the better we can craft policy that allows us to target that spending through programs, through policies, through practices that most effectively use those dollars, and outcomes and benefits and research enables us to craft that policy. Next, you know, a thing that is really important for Congress to be able to do is to go back to constituents. That includes farmers, stakeholders, folks who care about the environment, and tell them what Congress is doing for them with those billions of federal dollars, taxpayer dollars that are being spent. And while it's good to be able to say, you know, we authorized X billions of dollars and X millions of dollars were directed to Pennsylvania, what's more impactful is to be able to tell that story in terms of the actual outcomes and benefits that we're seeing on the farm, whether that be water quality improvements or soil health investments. That's really the story that that tells, that proves to constituents that Congress is getting things done. So, you know, these data and research and understanding of how federal investments are being used on the ground are most impactful to be able to tell that story. And then finally, you know, we care about conservation data and outcomes because we want to do better. We want to, you know, continue to enact policies that are going to innovate, build on existing policies. We don't just want the status quo. We know that, you know, farmers are innovators and they want to continue to improve on conservation investments. But to do that, we need a really complete understanding of the baseline impact of the current tools that are available, and the data and research that folks are doing across the country allows us to kind of take that information and craft policy that reflects the need and investment and continue to build and innovate through policy as well. So next slide. So hopefully now we can kind of all agree on the fact that policy and policymakers care about conservation data and outcomes. And, you know, I think there's a lot of work to be done to further policy and reforms that are going to support even more innovation and data gathering. But I do think it's important to point out that we definitely took some steps forward in the last Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, which was signed into law at the end of 2018. Had a couple of provisions that, again, move us in that direction of having better linkages between data outcomes and conservation program and policies. So one piece, some language from the Ag Data Modernization Act was included in that final Farm Bill. This really got at the linkage between conservation practices and the yields, the productivity, the soil health outcomes that are associated with those practices. All of that information is, of course, important for the federal crop insurance program. So, you know, there was some language in there directing USDA to do a full assessment of what data are out there right now, and to utilize those to kind of start to form that linkage between conservation practices and the outcomes associated with that, for the goal of better linking the full suite of tools that are available for ag and federal policy to conservation outcomes. So definitely a step forward there. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP, also included some new and innovative language that placed a stronger emphasis on program outcomes. RCPP pulls together partners and farmers and NRCS, and by including that language and kind of a prioritization on looking at the outcomes over the course of a project, the hope and goal is to be able to better pull from some of that information moving forward to understand kind of what are these partnerships actually bringing on the ground as it relates to water quality, soil health, especially in targeted areas, watersheds where we really want to see those natural resource improvements. And then finally, in the Farm Bill, there was also several instances of, in programs like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program, including language that directed USDA to prioritize, either through the ranking process or the payment rates, the most effective practices. And so by including that type of language, we're really saying, we need the data to understand how are we going to get the biggest bang for our buck when it comes to the, you know, hundreds of practices that are available through NRCS conservation programs. This is sending a message of we want to best target those practices to give us the outcomes that we want to see. And then finally, I think just to point out, as USDA NRCS moves forward with implementing a lot of the programs that were authorized in the 2018 Farm Bill, they are doing some exciting and innovative evaluation processes and rolling out a new tool, the Conservation Assessment and Ranking Tool, that I think, you know, from what I have seen and heard so far, does a good job at kind of trying to incorporate some of those evaluation and data-driven processes into the practice of actually awarding and implementing conservation practices. So next slide. Just a regional example from some of the work that we are doing in Pennsylvania. We, of course, Pennsylvania contributes significantly to the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and we have a lot of data when it comes to the problem. I think most folks in the watershed can tell you that unfortunately, that problem, and the data tells us, is very much focused on Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is responsible for 70% of the nitrogen reduction that EPA is saying is required to meet the goals in the region. We know that of that requirement, 80% of what Pennsylvania has to do is related to agriculture. So we've got a lot of data, we've got so much data that it is resulting in Maryland and Virginia and others suing EPA and Pennsylvania to get at the problem, much of which is focused on agriculture. But what, I hear from a lot of folks, and what a lot of frustration that is there, is that we don't have comprehensive data to help us understand how farmers, how conservation, how best management practices are contributing to efforts to improve the health of the bay. So we've got all this data when it comes to the problem, but we kind of have this piecemeal data when it comes to how farmers are actually contributing to improving the health of the bay. So, there have been some steps forward. I think at least 10 years ago, there was a Conservation Effects Assessment Project, CEAP, that focused on the Chesapeake Bay and conservation practices, but that's really at a landscape level, and again, almost 10 years old. Pennsylvania, Penn State is doing some surveying to get an understanding of what actually is going on the ground, especially in some of these high priority counties and watersheds. But we really don't have that comprehensive story of farmers are doing X, Y, and Z, and together that is contributing to the efforts that we know are needed in Pennsylvania to improve the health of the bay. And I think, that's something that farmers and environmentalists can agree on. We need better data to help us understand how farmers are contributing to these goals. From Senator Casey's perspective, wanting to improve the health of the bay and also support farmers in the Commonwealth, that data, those data are really essential to moving that forward. So last slide, final slide. Just to kind of, where do we go from here as it relates to policy? I think there are both challenges and opportunities. I say barriers, but I don't think they are barriers. They are challenges that I think we can overcome. But a lot of the times when we do have these conversations around data and outcomes, of course, the process of actually measuring, evaluating, reporting on what's going on the ground takes a lot of resources and capacity, whether that be NRCS capacity, other USDA resources, researchers, or farmers themselves. It is not an effortless process to invest in evaluation and monitoring. So I think, we need additional funding when it comes to conservation technical assistance, on the ground research, and we need partnerships between the work that's happening at USDA as well as a lot of the great private sector work that's going on. So I think resources are a concern, but definitely one that hopefully we can innovate and find policy solutions that really get us data advancements. And then additionally, something that often comes up when we talk about on-farm monitoring is concerns around privacy and protecting farmers and their identity and information on the ground. I think, that's of course a valid concern, and I don't think that the intent of anyone who's excited about getting better data is to kind of shame bad actors, but rather to be able to utilize that data for the betterment of the farmers, of the conservation outcomes. So, you know, all of the policies that are being discussed in Congress were worked on in the 2018 Farm Bill, and we're continuing to think about, definitely recognize that challenge. And I think it is a forefront as Congress continues to work on this issue. We want better data, and we also want to protect farmers' private data and not kind of shine a light on anyone who is doing anything wrong. So again, barriers I think we can overcome. And then finally, I think there are some opportunities to continue to take legislative action on these, excuse me, these needs and challenges. Speaking from efforts that Senator Casey has taken, the senator introduced the Farmer-Driven Conservation Outcomes Act of 2020. This bill directs USDA to measure, evaluate, and report on, excuse me, the outcomes associated with conservation programs. We're excited about this in terms of the opportunities to really understand how our USDA conservation programs achieving these goals, these outcomes. We see this as an opportunity both to tap into a lot of the water quality concerns that we know that are there from the Chesapeake Bay perspective, and also to think about these issues from a climate change perspective. How can we have the data we need to show how farmers are being part of the solution? And I think, you know, this bill moves that conversation in that direction, utilizing the existing programs and tools that are available through the Farm Bill. And then finally, from a policy perspective, you know, as has already been touched on, ecosystem service markets are an enormous opportunity for farmers to really benefit from the work that they are doing. But of course, they need the data and the information. So I see, you know, the efforts that are ongoing now as really being a tool, both in terms of public and private investments, to be able to further allow farmers to benefit from the services they are providing. So with that, I will turn it back over and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. Really appreciate the policy perspectives. Certainly from a selfish standpoint, I think that's just a great overview and some insights onto a few things around the policy and the politics that that will always be a part of this conversation. So right now we are going to work our way through questions. We have gotten a few through the question and answer tab here on the Zoom app. And we've got a few of our own, so please feel free to get those in, and myself, Stephen, and Kathy will try to get those in front of our panelists and work our way through it. So I want to start with a couple that came up, and I think one very quickly, this one for Sarah, with the USDA discussion in particular, the Ag Conservation Planning Framework, the ACPF. Can that accept additional data around farm level soils data, custom land use data, and even higher resolution data such as LIDAR?
Yes, the quick answer to that is yes, it can. It's designed to accept all of the spatial information that is available, including the ones listed in the question.
Great, thank you. Another one that came in, and it's sort of been mentioned maybe in a couple, or it's been sort of addressed a couple different ways, and this probably goes to both Sarah and to Steve, and this is about remote sensing and practices. So the understanding is that that remote sensing can get you percentages of, say, residue and other things that are sort of you know, circumstantial evidence, if you will, around practices, but not the actual practice data. So the question kind of comes to both of you. What do you foresee with remote sensing? What capabilities are needed, but that you also think we'll see greater use of, everything from drones to additional satellites. So if you can maybe plug in some looks into the future about what we might be able to see and how that remote sensing will get us closer to actual practices or a better understanding of what's going on in the fields. Sarah, if you want to take it, and then we can hand to Steve.
Sure. although I think Steve is the expert in this. I do think that, so to clarify, I saw the comment in the chat that the photo I showed was of a strip tillage system. So, and it doesn't, the remote sensing tools don't yet distinguish between various types of planting. They can let you know what percentage of, as was mentioned, of residue cover is left on the surface, which does tell you a lot about whether or not it's been fully tilled. So, but it doesn't tell you all of the details. There are a lot of, from USDA's perspective, there are a lot of surveys being done directly with producers. That is a very slow and expensive way of getting this data. And the more we can do it by remote sensing, the better. And the remote sensing tools are becoming more able to distinguish things all the time, things that you would never think could be distinguished by satellite. So I know they're working on mapping soil moisture as detected by satellite imagery. So there are kind of amazing things coming up in this area regularly. I think Steve is our expert there.
Thank you, Steve.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think, yeah, just building off of what Sarah mentioned, I think this is also in response to the note that Ben posted. Yeah, exactly right. So the tools like Optis are sensitive to the average fractional cover of residue on the soil surface. And that leaves out a couple of things, as Ben points out. That leaves out how that residue cover is arranged on the soil surface. And it also leaves out soil disturbance, which can be a pretty significant part of tillage practices. So there are limitations. You know, we continue to do research in this area to try to make better information products, and in a couple of those areas, specifically with the strip till, we've been working over the last few months with higher resolution data. I made a point in this presentation to note that we're working with publicly available data that typically comes at the 10 meter to 30 meter resolution. We're also doing research on using small sat and other data that come at a higher spatial resolution to get additional information that might be useful for adding layers of information to these products. And just to give you a couple examples of that, one, we're looking to integrate, we're working on integrating radar observations into the process to, again, get back to what Sarah was saying, to get a sense of sort of the structure of the material on the soil surface, as well as the moisture level. That can give us information in a couple of fronts. And often right now our publicly available products on cover crops are limited to presence and absence and a little bit of timing information. We're working on integrating the remote sensing and the crop growth DNBC biogeochemical modeling to produce operational maps of the vigor of cover crops, really to get a sense of the cover of those and the biomass being produced by those, so we can say more about the effectiveness of the cover crops on fields and within regions. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, that's good. So a question that came in, and I'm going to ask it, maybe modify it a little bit without, I think it's a great question about, and I may stumble on a little bit. It's the ArcGIS Pro 2.5 is the latest software. So this is a question about software adoption. And what I think of is maybe working through the panels from Steve to Sarah, and then even hand off to Alyssa to think about what some of the politics around this might be. But we understand that governments and universities can often struggle or be a little bit behind in trying to keep up on the latest software. So I don't know what perspectives you might have on that, Steve, but in particular, how that time lag in software adoption or software purchase and updating, you know, how much that impacts some of the usage as you develop tools around the private, or develop private tools around the public data. Maybe Sarah can add some further thoughts about the time lag or the challenges of getting, you know, the latest software used, and then maybe hand off then to Alyssa to even think about what that might look like in the congressional perspective, how some of this usage and the advancements we're seeing might help drive the politics and the challenges that you see in Congress to getting the agencies and universities to helping them speed up that adoption of the latest software. So sorry for the long question, but Steve, we can start with you and move through.
Sure. Yeah, I apologize if this isn't a direct answer to that question, but I would just want to share my experience. I, was trained using ArcGIS many years ago, and recognized the power of that tool and the work that Esri has done. Really, though, the explosion of open source tools over the last decade in particular, but even extending back beyond that, Python, Quantum GIS, other open source tools. There's so many projects out there that take a little bit of not always the most easy to use, especially for beginning sort of data scientists, geospatial data scientists, and end users. But I think a little bit of searching around and effort on that front can produce great results for any organization if you spend a little time getting used to some of the open source tools and the flexibility that's really afforded by joining some of those products as a community. And we have one geospatial, something we call GIPS, that is an open source project that helps with the whole process of remote sensing and data analysis, and encourage folks to just do a little bit of looking into open source tools that are out there.
Thanks, Sarah. Did you have some further thoughts on this?
Sure. One very specific response is that the tool that I mentioned that was asked about in the chat, in the question, the Conservation Planning Framework tool, ACPF, is compatible with ArcGIS Pro 2.5, as well as with some older versions. Related to kind of the general comment that federal agencies tend to be on the slow side in adopting and using the latest software, I'm not going to try to say that the federal government is fast at anything, because that's not what we're known for. The way within ARS, one of the ways that we try to address that issue is by developing partnerships with the private sector, and they then become developers with us with the tools, and we try to use their latest software as it becomes available. So the Partnerships for Data Innovations is one way in which we are attempting to do that.
Great, thank you for that. And certainly I can recall some of the struggles of keeping up with things. So it is not necessarily a knock on the federal agencies, that it is challenging for anybody, but with funding issues, and Alyssa, I think you mentioned some of that as we go from shutdowns and other budgetary challenges. Do you have any thoughts to add on this issue of the time lag in software adoption with the agencies and even universities, and how some of the politics around that may change as we see some of these benefits, or how you see that playing out a little bit?
Yeah, I think, Sarah spoke to some of the inherent challenges in terms of the work going on at USDA. And I think, the same goes for the pace at which Congress can respond to and update policies. The very nature of a farm bill being reauthorized every 5-ish years, I think, means that we want to craft policy that is, allows the agency to be as flexible and responsive to ever-changing data and new information as possible, because we can't just go in and update the legislative authorities when new information becomes available. I think, in some of the legislation that Senator Casey has been working on now to measure, evaluate, and report on data and conservation outcomes, that I think is partially why, we want to ensure there's that linkage between the agency and researchers and other work going on. I don't think we believe that any one sector can do it alone. And I think, we will be more flexible and be able to respond if those different pieces of the puzzle are kind of have a structure through which they can continuously be talking to each other. But I think, it definitely speaks to the importance of ensuring that we are crafting policy that allows for that kind of rapid evolution of information and data gathering.
Great, thank you to all three of you for those answers. I want to maybe switch focus a little bit and come at this from the farmer's angle and allow you all three of you to kind of take this question. We'll start again, Steve, and work our way through. And a little bit, I think, is something that Alyssa highlighted with the Chesapeake Bay, but also just a better understanding of the specific use cases that show value created and captured by farmers, things that you have seen from that perspective, and tying back around Alyssa's example, the Chesapeake Bay, starting back with Stephen on some of what you've seen as far as specific cases on value.
Sure. I'm not sure I have a full grasp of the question, but I guess I would want to mention a couple of efforts that I'm aware of and some that we're participating in. There's an effort called Open Team that's founded by FAR, Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, working to, it sort of links back to the last question about tools as well, open source tools, but it's a collaborative effort from many institutions, research universities, private sector and industry and organizations like ours, working together to make sure our tools and technology talk to each other to meet farmers' needs and bring value to farmers. And we're just about a year into a 3 or 4 year project there, but some of the tools coming out of that, I think have a lot of potential and are exciting. I mean, there are scenario planning tools that are being developed that incorporate information from multiple different organizations that can allow a grower to understand what a change in practice might mean for them in terms of productivity and in terms of outcomes. There are tools to examine the productivity on your field and compare it to productivity in past years on that field. And I think the vision is to also, as these ecosystem service markets develop, the vision is to tie the sort of work that Open Team is doing in that farm OS system directly with opportunities in ecosystem service markets. So I think that, lots is going on there. And I think for the most part, most people that we interact with recognize that farmers have to be at the center of these technologies and making sure that farmers, benefit. So that's my take.
Thank you, Sarah.
Jonathan, can you repeat the question? Steve mentioned he wasn't sure he caught it, and I'm not sure I did either.
Yes, and I am going back to the specific use cases that show that value has been created by and captured by farmers. So it goes a little bit to what Alyssa had mentioned around Chesapeake Bay and some of the piecemeal challenges, but anything that you've seen or some specific uses that show the value.
The two main things that I've seen that show value that's being created by farmers, for farmers, basically, is when they are able to use the digital ag tools in order to monitor profitability of specific activities within their own farm at the subfield level. So that enables them to plan better how to implement conservation practices and just regular agricultural management practices. And the other one is with the emergent ecosystem services markets that Steve was talking about.
Great, thank you. And Alyssa, I want to give you a chance to jump in on that as well, based on what you've seen and any other thoughts on sort of this on the value that you have seen created.
Yeah, and I think that's what's been good to see in terms of the work going on in Pennsylvania. Farmers are excited and want to be kind of part of the solution as it relates to bay challenges, both in terms of outcomes for them, but also improving water quality. There's some innovative approaches going on, especially around dairy, building in conservation planning into dairy management plans and contracts, which ultimately then benefits those dairy farmers who are able to kind of have that groundwork. And again, you know, in all of these instances, I think especially as we think about planning and outcomes, those data and an understanding of the benefits are really important. And I think some of those efforts to really pay for performance can be further expanded the better the information on outcomes that we have.
All right, and we are coming closer to the end of this, but I do have, there was a series of questions, and I'm going to try to summarize them together around, always want to tread lightly on legal issues, but around some of the concerns about data privacy and protection, and how that can be, how you can sort of strike that balance between protecting the data privacy issues the farmer has, but still making the tools available and using publicly available data, like sort of how this all combines. So if we can again start with Steve and work through around some of the data privacy and other kind of implications, then Alyssa we'll finish up with you as sort of what you've been hearing and maybe some of the other discussions in Congress about just how much of a priority that protection is, and maybe some thoughts on what can be worked on there. So Steve, back to you. Privacy and protecting the farmer's interest or concerns about the data.
Sure. I think others can probably do a better job answering this than I can. But so you know, I just recognize, as I sort of highlighted it in my presentation, the foundational piece that on-field observations, they're critical to all the tools built on top of that, remote sensing, modeling, and so those tools will get better if the more they are exposed to and tested against field observations. And I know that, you know, as we're talking about resilience, we've got the Risk Management Agency, RMA, and FSA have a lot of information that exists on things related to risk at the farm field level, and I think there's a way to expose those data in a way that protects producer privacy to groups of researchers that apply. And I mentioned the FIA efforts on the forest side of things. And again, I don't have details on how that works, but from my perspective, you know, we're producing what, you know, we call raster maps of outcomes. I mentioned they're at the 30-meter level. I can envision an exchange where we apply, or other researchers at universities apply, to have their information products checked against reality, on-field measurements. And in that case, an extensive amount of these maybe rasters or the complete set of field data are thrown over the wall to the FSA or to this data warehouse, and they're checked against reality and the outcomes, the relationship between the modeled estimates and the measured estimates are provided back in summary. So that's just me, without the details, proposing one potential solution. I think that everybody could benefit from that.
Thank you, Steve. Sarah, anything to add on the privacy questions and maybe some of the other concerns that come in with data, and how what you've seen, and how even the publicly available data and usage between the farmers' privacy concerns, but also the public sort of facing concerns of issues around outcomes and results and enforcement issues?
Right. So one thing that should be a little bit reassuring is that USDA employees are pretty strictly bound by privacy, data privacy regulations. So we are not allowed to share data in certain categories mostly personally identifiable information. But we are commanded basically to share data at an aggregate level so that it can inform research and modeling and inform policy as well. I recognize also that there is certainly a reluctance on the part of some producers to share data with the government specifically. It's not just that they need to be able to trust us that we won't misuse it, it's that they don't want us to have it to begin with. And I respect that and I can understand it. And I have posted on the discussion forum a piece about farmer perspectives on collecting and sharing data, which is very interesting. I can't remember now, I got it, it was sent to me by someone in the last couple of weeks, maybe even as part of this forum last week, I don't know. I can't remember where I got it, but it gives some very interesting farmer perspectives on when they do and don't want to share data with people, including the government.
Great, thank you for that. And again, another good reminder that on that collaboration space, there's quite a bit of information there. Alyssa, I'll give you the last word here on some of the privacy concerns and how those line up as well with efforts to measure outcomes and enforcement concerns or enforcement questions and what you see from Congress's perspective.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think having worked on the legislation that the senator introduced to better measure, evaluate, and report on conservation outcomes, a good amount of the feedback that we heard from ag groups was that, you know, it is absolutely essential to protect those data. So to Sarah's point about ensuring that data is aggregated, we made sure that if any data would be shared with outside researchers, which we do think is essential, you know, I don't think that USDA can do it alone, that it would remain in that aggregated form. I don't think, you know, the goal of protecting individual producer identities is in conflict with the goal of being able to utilize all of the data on outcomes that we have. I think we can absolutely do both. I think that, you know, as Congress continues to work on these issues, it is important to make sure that those protections are in place, especially as we think outside of the USDA box, where we know that, you know, that clear guidance is there to follow. But as we start thinking about outside partners, we need to make sure that that goal and process of protecting identities remains firm. I think, you know, there's still probably a good amount of work to do on the messaging and engaging with farmers, you know, because many farmers do have that initial reaction of, I'm just not comfortable sharing it for concerns X, Y, and Z. I think that there's a good amount of work to do to kind of figure out what kinds of assurances and protections are necessary to widen the net of folks who are willing to come to the table and kind of be excited about participating in these efforts, while also not worrying that, you know, they're putting themselves at risk in doing so.
Oh, those are good points. That I'm looking at the time and realizing we probably could ask hours more questions, which is yet another plug for the collaboration part of the website. If you're like me, this will stick in your mind for a while, and then you'll wake up in the middle of the night with questions. So that's a good time to get those in, and we can continue the conversation, the dialogue. I just want to thank Steve and Sarah and Alyssa for joining us today, and for this the great presentations and the answering the questions and the dialogue that we have. And we really appreciate you guys taking your time and providing some insights. We appreciate everybody that has attended here as well. We will just sort of wrap things up here quickly. If you have more questions, again, go to the workshop's website and the collaboration page for that. I also just want to take a moment to thank Sherry and Morgan and Martha, the team at Farm Foundation, that have been absolutely phenomenal to work with us on this and keeping somebody like myself from making too many mistakes while live on the internet. So I appreciate the work you guys have done. And with that, Sherry, I hand it off to you for the final closing remarks and reminders.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan, for moderating and for your partnership. And thank you again to all the speakers. Wonderful to have you with us today, and look forward to more conversations as we move on. I was so tempted to, as some of you know, put on my farmer hat. I am a 5th generation farmer, and I always say you got to have a farmer in the room, and I was, I guess, the farmer in this room today. So I withheld some of my comments, but that is something we can continue over the informal coffee break. And just a reminder that in the chat box is the link. You need to copy and paste it if you do wish to join us in the informal coffee chat. It maybe is food for thought in our forum that maybe we need to have a farmer chat section to encourage more farmer input as we continue this series, and maybe I can post some comments there as well. So just as wrapping up again, remember to copy and paste that link if you wish to join us in the informal coffee break. As you've noticed, this is a series, so we invite you and encourage you to join us in the 3rd series, which will be this Friday, May 29th. We hope that you'll be able to join us for that. More information of that is also on the website. So with that, I think we'll wrap up for today. Again, we thank each of you for joining us today online, and our speakers, and we look forward to being back here with you all on our 3rd series on May 29th. So with that, we'll conclude this workshop and hope to see you next time. Thank you.